Yep.
Okay. So we've got like customers and users, and they can be separate. Would you never define your product as what you're offering to your users, even if like your users are your primary motivation? I mean.
No, I think of it as a customer acquisition strategy.
Okay, so you think of the users. You're only designing something for the users, so that you can bring them to the place where you can then monetize them and get money from the customers.
Right. Although in reality, the way as a VC you sort of you think about these in two very different ways, right? So, like Reid Hoffman often talks about how quickly can you get to 10 million users, right? If you're all about users and your model is ad based, you have to be one of the top 5 internet companies in the world to really be these huge behemoth companies. So if that's your business model, you just acquire a ton of users and then you're going to support it with ads, then you have to explain how do you get to 10 million uniques a month. And I think that's one way to think about it, right? Because then it's sort of your user acquisition is funding your customers. Yeah?
My question's a little off topic on this, but...
Okay, so let me finish this then. The customers then, if you're thinking about dollars, then instead of just users, we're thinking about how do you get to $100,000 a month in revenues within year 1, and then how do you get to $1 million a month in year 2. And that's sort of the way we think about accelerated ramp and growth. So that's sort of one way to think about it. Any other questions on that?
Just kind of a quick follow-up.
Yeah.
I guess like if you're making a pitch and you're talking about kind of the whole problem solution thing, do you not talk about problem solution as it relates to the users? Do you only focus on what problem are we solving for our customers?
No, I mean, because if your user is your customer acquisition strategy, this is absolutely important, right? So within the business model, that's a great segue. Your business model then also needs to take into account user or customer acquisition. And we often call this demand creation. Right? So demand creation, so if your demand creation strategy is when you get a ton of users, the advertisers will come, right? Then your demand creation needs to also tell me, then how are you going to acquire users on this side? And that's sort of, are you going to, is there some sort of community that they reside in that you can raid? Are they just sort of organically discovering you, and why is that? Is there some place that they're looking for a solution? Are they at trade shows looking for a solution where you can set up, right? Or are you going to have a direct sales force that goes out and finds these customers? You have to be able to tell us, how do you do demand creation and what does that cost us? And then sort of very similar to that is then your sales strategy, which we call sort of channels and sales. So this is, once they know about you, then how do they get the product out of your hands, right? So how do you actually sell to these people once they find out about you? So that could be, if it's sort of just users and you have a website, your channel's your website. But the customer then, how do they buy from you? Do you have a sales force that's selling ads? Do you have a direct sales force that's knocking on doors? Do you have women that are throwing Tupperware parties? You know, what is that access point for your customers? Does that make sense? And what you're trying to do is you have costs associated with building product, and you have costs associated with demand creation and getting leads into the system, and you have costs associated with actually acquiring those customers. Your hope, against all hope, is that the price that you're able to charge against that will make up for all of that. Yep.
So could you like maybe give an example of like a company and then how this, like, so Facebook, how these parts kind of...
Yeah, so Facebook is a good example. I mean, I guess their business model continues to change, but their customers could be either the end users who are buying Facebook credits,
Yeah.
Or it's advertisers right now, right? the users are all of us who are on Facebook, who have friends on Facebook. The demand creation, if for a large company, that's a lot harder to say because they already have brand, right? So if I think about a small upstart company, a lot of times we're talking about demand creation from the perspective of SEO, SEM. Some companies have direct sales models where you have an enterprise sales force that goes out and knocks on doors. You have inside telesales, people who are calling up prospective customers, and that can also mix in with channel and sales, right? And so demand creation is sort of a bigger component of that, where you can think about trunk shows, trade shows, magazine ads, PR, SEO, SEM, all of these things. Does that make sense? Yep.
When Twitter came to you, what stage were they at?
They were at the ODO stage. So they were a podcasting company. They offered to give Mike money back when it failed, and iTunes actually launched their podcasting service. And then Mike just sort of offered to put it into whatever was next, and that happened to be Twitter.
Okay, and then how were they going about, like, what were they defining as their customers?
They were actually, I think they were very internally focused, right? So they felt that they were their best users. They were the example of their own users.
Okay.
So they just started using this sort of short service, and they thought it was valuable, and they found that it took off amongst the tech circle.
Do you think it's, from the VC perspective, is it ideally you want them to be their own customer because they're going to understand the problem the best? Or is that
not necessarily, right? So I look for authenticity in the entrepreneur. And by authenticity, I'm looking for someone who understands the market in a very unique way. And so that might be from a technical perspective. So if you're, I just invested in a PhD student coming out of Stanford who has a new fluorescence microscope. And he was able to create fluorescence microscope, 3 of which will sit in the palm of your hand. The other ones are like huge, they're workbenches, right? And so he has a technical insight that he can create these small fluorescence microscopes that fit in the palm of your hand. I invested in a jewelry company, right? And it was, so for those of you who know like the Avon model, the Tupperware model, I saw some of you guys smile when I was talking about the Tupperware parties. I've always thought that that was fascinating, right? That you don't have actually a modern, young woman's version of the Tupperware party now that social media has really taken on. So I was looking into this for 2 to 3 years, and then finally I come across a woman who has 15 years of experience in the jewelry market. And she sold Cutco knives in college and was one of the award-winning salespeople at Cutco knives. And she's always thought about melding these two business models. There's one other company that's sort of in this space. They've never really taken advantage of the e-commerce space, but we just believed that if she could get this off the ground, she understood the whole value chain. She's actually selling to college students. It's for young women, really the core demographic, the salespeople that we're looking for in college right now. So she's not the customer, but man, does she understand the market. She understands the margins. She knows exactly what the landed cost ought to be. She knows exactly who the best manufacturers are in China. She knows the best designers, and she's poached 2 of them from Henry Mandel's already. Within 6 months, she told me she would have 85 SKUs done, designed, manufactured, and ready to go in the inventory center. She had all of the contracts done, and sure enough, she was launching parties in April. I mean, incredible, right? But that's what I'm looking for. I don't actually believe that you have to be the customer to your own goods, but you should know something about that market that no one else does. And that's what makes it defensible, and that's where your passion comes from. Yeah.
Could you go through a little more in detail, what's the process of you actually discovering a company that you would be willing to invest in?
What's the question again?
The process that you actually go through to actually decide to invest in a company.
Okay. Yeah, are we okay sort of transitioning away from business model? Yeah.
Actually, I was actually hoping you would maybe talk about how the financing works into, like, into this model. Like
Financing, so
Yeah.
yeah, so that's sort of a good transition. So this is sort of always at the back of my head. What are the assumptions that you're making about product, demand creation, pricing, cost, channels and sales? Who are your customers? How well do you know your customers? How well do you know your users? And what you notice here is product is just one small component of that, right? So think about the pitches that you've seen or you've created in your life. I guarantee you 90% of what you spent your time on was the product, right? And half the time I'm sitting there like, I'm at the edge of my feet, at the edge of my seat saying, that's great, but what can you tell me about all the rest? Oh, we haven't really launched that. We're in private beta. We've tested it with our 10 best friends, and they all say it's fantastic, right? Or, demand creation, that's what we're going to fund. And so, for me, I love the entrepreneur who's just figured it out on a credit card and maybe a couple $1,000s that they scrounged up from their friends. Or put together dummy tests that start to show exactly what that customer acquisition might look like. At Stanford, what we ask the students to do is create dummy websites. Like one of my students was creative enough to have, a registration process that was 40 steps deep, just because he wanted to test how desperate these people were, right? And he was like, well, these, 20% actually went through all 40 steps, so they must actually really need a solution.
Wow.
So, right, like, be creative. And I think some of the things that people do is it's so easy to get funding these days. You're waiting for funding. Don't wait for funding. If you're waiting for funding to answer some of these questions, it means you're fundamentally not an entrepreneur. You're not passionate enough about the problem. Because if you're passionate enough about the problem, you're paranoid that someone else is going to figure it out and get to it first. So you're just going to figure it out before anyone else is, regardless of whether or not you have money in the bank. And those are the entrepreneurs, because at every step of the way, after you get funding, you're gonna head into some sort of hiccup. You're gonna have someone tell you something mean on a certain day, and you're gonna feel sad about it. And man, you're gonna have to pick yourself up and go, right? And the best entrepreneurs are the ones that hear no a million times, and they hear yes once, and that's the only thing that they heard. Right, and so that I think what I'm always really attracted to are people who are starting to figure all of this out. And it was interesting to me. We recently spoke to Peter Thiel about what the environment looks like, and one of the things he said was a leading indicator for him about how a company is going to do is whether or not they're able to attract talent at sort of sub-market prices, which I thought was really interesting, right? Because I too often hear entrepreneurs come through my door and say, I need to raise financing because my 2 engineers are working at Google, and so to convince them to leave Google, I need financing. That probably tells me you don't have a compelling narrative to tell these entrepreneurs why they should risk it all. If you can't do that for your first 2 engineering employees, how are you going to scale that? Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a little bit more about kind of like this business plan in a tactical way. So let's say that you had, a product that you wanted to develop, whatever. Let's say you went somewhere in the Midwest and you realized that nobody travels and you thought that was a problem. You wanted to fix it. How would you go about creating such a business model? Like, what are the concrete kind of steps that you would take to make this?
So our first lecture is around customer and users. So you spend your first week finding all the customers and users out there that you can, and filling in who you think they are, what is the demographic, what's the psychographic, talking to them, right, and understanding where their problem lies. And how big a problem is that? The second thing you do is then really understand, now that you understood how deep that problem is for a particular customer, now you want to understand how big that customer problem is. So is this a $1 million market, $10 million market, $100 million market, $1 billion market, $100 billion market, right?